Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Shades of Entrepreneurship. This is your host, Mr. Gabriel Flores. Today, I am here with Dario, and we're going to be talking about drones, folks. I'm very excited about this conversation. I was telling Dario earlier, very unique. I'm interested about the case use because I've been trying to figure out what's the best use for drones, and so I would love to hear about it. But before we get into all that, Dario, give us a little introduction. Who are you? Where are you calling in from? Give us a little background.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. My name's Dario. I'm the founder of Carbonix, live in Sydney, Australia, calling from here. Background is really period of my career in yacht racing, in yacht design. So making boats go faster, basically. Initially at sort of the club level, working my way up to professional racing, and eventually spending the best part of a decade in America's Cup racing. And the passion has always been eking out that last 1% of performance out of a racing vehicle. And so getting the structures, the aerodynamics, the setup to a point where they work better and go faster.
So how did you, that is first and foremost awesome. That is another story in itself. How did you get into that first and foremost? Like, that sounds like a lot of math and a lot of getting into numbers, because you mentioned about the air, but how did you get in that?
Yeah, I was interested in it at a very young age. And I think the way the sport works, I guess like a lot of other sports, there are club level events that you can get involved in. You go down and put your hand up and help out, learn as much as you can, seek out the knowledge, find the right mentors, prove a certain amount of sort of understanding and capability. In my case, there was a bit of that. There was actually building radio-controlled yachts, like little models, and sailing them across the pool and across the lake, and just understanding how they work, and then just being able to test it out at every opportunity. So go racing, change things around, look at how the cause and effect. So when you tweak something on a boat, how does it behave differently? What effect does it have? What are the trade-offs? It might make it faster in one circumstance and slower in another. And then you go out and you race and you test. And then as you get involved in sort of more professional programs, you find there's a structure there around how you do that, how you do the cost-benefit analysis. At the time that I was involved as well, there was a growing prevalence of computer modeling. So fluid dynamics, finite element analysis, and how you integrate that with tank test results and wind tunnel. So yes, a lot of maths, but it's very empirical, very much build it, test it, get a result, iterate, and then look at what other people are doing, see how that compares, and becoming part of a team where there's a lot of specialized knowledge. So the way my career path went is I did a lot of that, went to uni, dropped out, went back to it, went back, finished uni, always with sort of an engineering bent, and then got involved in the America's Cup. And initially very technical work, like being a boat builder, being part of the design team, but also being curious about how the organization works, how the team works, and how you fund it, because you need the money to have fun. And so understanding that side of it as well, because it all goes to the resources are something that then enables you to be competitive. And so getting the resources is part of the challenge.
Talk us through that a little bit, because I'm interested myself, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of listeners. Tell us about the team. You mentioned there's a whole team that goes into making the boats. Kind of tell us about who's all involved in this team and what is their kind of responsibilities, because it kind of all kind of seems to come together to create one cohesive team.
Absolutely. So as an abstract problem, you have a very specific, call it artificial set of rules, right? Has to be sail powered, has to be a certain length, weights, materials, and then you've got the rules of the actual racing. So you have this framework. And then the challenge is, how do I get to race day, which is a fixed, immutable deadline, with the best possible combination of performance, usability, versatility, reliability, and you work backwards from there. So again, this has evolved. Like the America's Cup started in 1851, so there's been a lot of time for things to iterate. You have specializations in everything from the material science that goes into making the structures lighter and more efficient. You've got aerodynamics and the hydrodynamics, and it's sort of a packaging exercise. You're saying, what is the most efficient possible shape I can wrap this structure in to have the minimum drag and the maximum lift and all the characteristics that you want. Then there's a human machine interface where you've got, the crew has to sail the boat. So you have mechanical systems and ways to actually handle the loads generated by a powerful sailboat. And so those disciplines all have to work together to come up with a package. And they all pull in different directions. So, the structures guy might want to make the boat really strong, but that ends up being heavy and bulky. The aerodynamics guy wants it to make really a shrink-wrapped minimalist shape, but that might not work structurally. And they all sort of talk to each other and meet halfway. And then you start developing, I guess, computer models that will make those trade-offs and iterate. And eventually, like now with AI, you can do those iterations, in the thousands, in the millions, very automatically. Before that, you'd make a model, put it in the tank test, in the test tank, put it in the wind tunnel, get that data, use that to calibrate your CFD and your FEA. And so there's this big sort of spiral and loop and coordination. So it's very multidisciplinary. And then when you look at, the sails, the rig, it's a cloth membrane. So the mechanics of that, the battens, it's a bit like a bat's wing. How does that interact with the structure of the boat? How do you optimize the shape? And how do you allocate your resources to get the best bang for your buck? Because you could spend all your money on optimizing one small part of the boat that then only gives you a small advantage, or you could focus on something else and get a much bigger advantage. So making that trade-off is really that collaborative effort, where you look at the effect that all the different advantages possibly accrue and come up with the right trade-off and put it in time and space, because there's a sequence required to do the execution, to design, to build, to test, and it all happens concurrently. You're out testing version 1, you're building version 2. And so when you look at the composition of a team, you'll have a certain number of designers with different specialties, certain number of manufacturers that are really adept at that sort of rapid prototyping, one-off, building structures, solving problems. You'll have an aero group that looks after the sails and the rig. There'll be a performance group that looks after the tuning and the development of the boat. And then on the sailing side, it's an athletic program. You've got sailors who are professional athletes, that they've got to be fit, they've got to be mobile, getting all their optimization to have the strength and the stamina and the weight and the techniques. And within that structure, you have sort of a primary group, and then you have reserves that are there ready to take over. So yeah, you end up anything from 200 to 250 people. Wow. To do an America's Cup campaign over a period of usually it's about 4 years. And there have been historically requirements about, for example, building the boat in the country of the challenger. And so you generally either collaborate with an existing facility, or you set up your own facility to build the boat. So you have to be very creative, self-sufficient. And it's an environment where, because it's competitive, it's not a 9 to 5. People want to be there, want to do the best that they can. And so it sort of feeds on itself. It's very high energy, very intense. And then after the last race, you take 6 months off and recover.
What's interesting about that, it sounds like each race in itself is it's his brand new own entrepreneurial endeavor. I mean, the fact that you go into the planning stages, almost like each boat design too, because I'm assuming you don't just make one boat at a time, but having to have those conversations between the different engineers and the different pieces, to making sure, like you mentioned, the weight versus the buoyancy versus the lightness versus, like, all of those things have to come together. And that happens, like, that's folks, that's entrepreneurship 101 right there. Like, at the end of the day, when you're creating a business, I just got out of a meeting earlier today. I think a lot of nonprofits right now, we tend to do the same tools, the same tasks in the communities, yet we're also fighting for the same funding. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is break bread with a lot of different nonprofits and say, hey, we're doing it. We're in the same arena. Why don't we apply for these grants together? Gives us a better opportunity to capture the grant, maybe even actually be rewarded more funding because of it, and continue to grow in that way. Now, Dario, you're taking all this information now. You've been doing the boat racing, and then did you go into the the drones after that, or was there a middle piece? And how did that kind of transition take place?
Pretty much straight away. The idea was the some of the technology that was developed in the last America's Cup campaign that I was a part of was very specific around aeroelastic structural design. So looking at how a composite structure, so carbon fiber structure, behaves under aerodynamic loads. So being able to predict how, as a wing loads up aerodynamically, it'll flex. And as it flexes, its geometry changes. And you want that change geometry to be the optimum when you're actually flying. And so having that understanding of how to make lightweight, efficient structure that behaves in an optimum way, it sort of became fairly obvious that applying that to an aircraft would give you fuel savings, better range, better performance, the ability to carry more payload. And looking at that opportunity and thinking, well, with sort of traditional aviation, it's a long development cycle and it's the sort of some big established players. It's a bigger challenge, I guess, to go into that. But when I started Carbonix, the promise of drones was just starting to be on the horizon. And it was very obvious that you had a bias towards, I guess, the electronics and the payloads, because a lot of the companies that started out in the drone space had a really good camera or a really good set of command and control algorithms, so to speak. But they were mainly multi-rotors. So when you think of a drone, you think of a quad or an octo. So it's this thing with a lot of rotors on it that just sort of buzzes around. That makes it easy to use and practical because it can hover, it can fly backwards, it can sort of sit there in the sky. And the sort of PID loops and the ability to stabilize a machine like that, independent of the pilot, because the reaction times have to be in the order of milliseconds, that was becoming a thing. So there was that promise that you could actually put one of these things together at a reasonable cost. You can put a decent payload on it, and you can go and film, you can go and scan, you can sort of do useful things with it. But that configuration is inherently limited because of the power source, because they're electric, and because of the aerodynamics of the rotors. They're fairly inherently inefficient. And so you're kind of leashed to that 20-minute, half-hour flight time, and it doesn't scale. You can throw more batteries at it, the thing gets heavier, your flight time stays the same. And so looking at being able to do those scans, that sort of eye in the sky, with a longer range so that you can cover more distance, which then brings the unit economics down because you're not having to relocate the pilot every half an hour to the next location. You can take off, you can go and fly for 6-8 hours, cover a large area, get that information, come back and land and make it useful. That was really the key to say I knew about, I had this technology that could develop an airframe that had that capability, and we could do it at commercial prices without going into something that was already a thing, that was the military fixed wing drones that have the performance, but they're in the order of tens of millions of dollars. And so that middle ground, using it for commercial applications with the range and leveraging existing payloads and existing electronic features that we could just incorporate and really adding value very specifically on the platform was sort of the vision and how it all started. And that then leads to having to solve specific problems about how do you launch it and retrieve it, for example, because a fixed wing aircraft needs a certain amount of airspeed to stay in the air. So you either have to have a runway to get it up to speed, or you have to launch it off a catapult. Similarly, with retrieval, you need a runway to land, or you need a net or some way to catch it. And again, that's not practical. The ground footprint of that equipment makes it onerous. And so being able to incorporate a vertical takeoff and landing capability means we sort of have the best of both worlds. We can take off vertically, we can transition to forward flight, and then we are an efficient fixed wing aircraft that can cover large distances. And interestingly, the focus for me was always that eye in the sky capability rather than deliveries. Because again, the delivery play, it's a slightly different problem in terms of the interactions you have to have at the end of the journey, whether you're dropping off a parcel at someone's house and you're looking at potentially using an airport anyway because you've got runways. So really the idea was focus on inspections, scans, basically carrying a camera or a LiDAR, look at customers in sort of the critical infrastructure space where there is demand, it's at large scale, and there's a real dent we can make in terms of the cost, the frequency, the safety, the carbon footprint, and really focus on that market. And so the journey has been develop the airframe, develop the VTOL system, incorporate what avionics are required for the command and control, and then start tackling all the problems around automated flight, the user interface. And again, with that approach of really going for the low-hanging fruit, how do we get something that does the job at the price, in time, in the real world, in weather, and basically building the business around that.
Yeah, I really one thing that I find just absolutely very fascinating was your ability to the vertical take flight versus the
Mm.
runway. I think that's really unique because folks, I have one of those small drones. So folks, you probably go to Target or Costco, right? You've seen those little kid drones. They have the four propellers on them, and that's what Dario is talking about, right? And those are the ones we can see and they go straight up and down, right? But he created, and by all means, I check out theshadesofE.com. I'll have this information. Go subscribe to the website. But essentially, what he created was like a full size style airplane that, but is able to take up, goes up and down. But the beauty of it is there's a lot of use case scenarios. So Dario, I want you to kind of explain some of the in like one of you mentioned your focus was the eye in the sky, right? You wanted to be the eye in the sky. So could you provide a little some industry solutions of your product to make it real practical sense for the folks listening at home. So give us some like use cases, scenarios of your drone that being used by industry, and then what data do you provide them in with the eye in the sky?
Yeah, absolutely. So power lines are a great example. When you look at power transmission, you have these towers and wires that are out in the landscape, and middle of nowhere. These are critical. Generally, they'll go through, for example, a forest or a national park. You have vegetation encroachment. You have trees that are growing into the lines all the time, and potentially they can start a fire. They can cause damage if they touch the wire. So the infrastructure operator has to make sure seasonally, every 6 months, that there is this separation between the line and the trees. And to do that at scale, you need eyes on what's happening. Um, Satellite is a potential solution, but it's limited by the distance and potential cloud cover and things like that. So traditionally, the only way to do it is with a helicopter. And now you're talking about a multi-ton machine with two people in it, burning tons of fuel, flying low and slow, which is potentially dangerous because if something goes wrong, you don't have a lot of time to recover. Um, and it's a really inefficient way to do it, but it's necessary because you need to be able to get this information to then tell the ground crew, go to this spot and cut down this tree or cut back these branches or whatever it is. And generally, they do a flight beforehand. They identify the areas that need to be cut back, and then they'll do a flight after to make sure that it's been done to spec. And so that's expensive and it's dangerous and it burns a lot of fuel. So being able to do that with a drone, we will fly the power line using a LiDAR scanner, which is basically a glorified version of your barcode reader in the supermarket, creates a point cloud with time and distance that shows you the shape of what it's seeing on the ground. So it'll pick up the poles, the wires, the leaves, the branches, and the ground. Once you have that 3D model, you can then iterate that over time. So you'll have one from every couple of weeks, and you'll put it through an AI that can detect differences between the status of the model at different times, identify the bits which are of interest, and then you'll be able to give very specific instructions to go in and do the pruning. Now, eventually, you could probably do the pruning with a drone as well, but we're not there yet. You're still using ground crews to go out and do the job, but you've saved that helicopter flight. Now,
Uh,
because of our ability to, again, fly low and slow with a high resolution LiDAR, and we can actually combine that with photography as well, so we can get an RGB sort of colorization of the LiDAR point cloud. You can also look at the conditions of the infrastructure. So you can look at, for example, is the sag in the catenary of the line within specs, or is it out? Is it drooping too
Interesting.
much? Are the footings of the tower subsiding? Are all the fasteners in the tower correct? If it's a wooden pole, is there rot in the pole? So it's really assessing the condition of infrastructure. So an analogous use case to that is an open cut mine, where you're looking at tailings dams, the volume of spoils, how the walls of the mine, the angles, the ramps, being able to do that scan, get that information quickly at high resolution, efficiently, without disrupting the ground operations, then feeds into the planning process for how the mine is being managed. And that information is hugely valuable to the mine because it means they can narrow down their forecasts and their predictions of what will be needed and what the output is going to be. So there are two use cases. There's a few others that are similar, but it's all about procuring information for critical infrastructure in order to manage it more efficiently.
So again, I find this extremely remarkable because Dario, I live here in the West Coast. I'm here in Oregon. As you know, you may know the California area has just been recently devastated with wildfires, right? And this is a great, I love your use case because it's applicable to the West Coast right now where it's fire season. And we do have, vegetation that is constantly outgrowing the support that it needs to be pruned. And there are these areas. In fact, I believe there was some video of this most latest fire where it may have actually caught fire because of the power line in the vegetation. And so it's like having these things, and to your point as well, the cost of the helicopters, the carbon footprint it leaves, the safety measures, the safety because if the wind picks up, especially the way the wind was picking up in this most recent wildfire, it's absolutely unsafe to even fly in those conditions as it is. But at the same time, the need for it, and I really love I was going to ask you if you did this, but the forecasting, that is really cool. Being able to see the current stage of the plantation and then where it possibly is going to be grown in the next 3 to 6 to 5 10 weeks or whatever the case may be, and then creating a plan around that. Because I think another good case for it is you can begin to talk about the efficiency of the workers, right? Because we do have limited amount of staff, we do have limited amount of funding to go to these much needed services, so we need to be more efficient, right? And I like what you're kind of doing, because I always tell people, humans aren't going to lose their jobs to AI. Humans are going to lose their jobs to humans using AI because it makes us more efficient, makes us faster, makes us better, quicker what we can do. And if I'm able to do something that's the same speed as 3 people because I use AI, but it's still my content, I'm still putting together, I'm using it as an outline, whatever the case may be, I become more efficient. I become more effective, right? And so that's important. And to Dario's point, now you can essentially go in there and you can say, hey, the mind, this is where I want to go. Safety is a big concern because obviously you don't want the mind to collapse on anybody, right? So that's what Dario was mentioning. That's really cool too. Again, that planning, I suspect, again, I'm not a miner, folks, but I suspect that planning probably took a lot of months and maybe even years to plan, because as Dario was mentioning, you're looking at samples, you're looking at the actual the minerals that are in the walls, and how thick is it, how thin is it, where can you go versus not go, because again, if that thing collapses, you've seen movies, there's Hollywood, every time a thing collapses, Hollywood has a new movie, right? It seems like. And so these things do occur, and safety is certainly the top priority. So it's very, very fascinating. Now, do you have did you get, is this like not a trademark, but a IP, like an intellectual property? Is this like yours and yours only kind of thing?
Yes. So the trick, I guess, the thing to make the technology that we have, all the different bits and pieces have to be right. So again, it's very multidisciplinary. So similar to what I was saying about America's Cup, you've got an airframe, which is a carbon fiber structure. It has to be wrapped around and packaged around avionics. The avionics have to do the command and control. They have to withstand the vibration, the temperature fluctuations, the humidity, all the adverse conditions in which they have to operate. They have to be able to respond to upsets to gusts of wind to all the different conditions that the aircraft will require. And you've got two very different regimes because when you're in the vertical flight, there's a set of controls that basically manipulate the aircraft one way. And then when you're in horizontal flight, you're using control surfaces that behaves differently again. And that transition is really critical where you're in between the two regimes. You're too slow for your control surfaces to have effect, but you're still moving faster than a multi-rotor would normally fly. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with wind when you've got, tail and wings hanging out of a multi-rotor? All of those problems have to be solved, and that requires the theoretical understanding, the practical ability to create something that'll do that task, and the testing. So, you can throw as much money at it as you like, but it's a 3-year program to put an aircraft through the sort of testing that will give you enough engineering rigor and data to then go to a regulator and say, this thing is actually going to stay in the air and do what we say it's going to do. So if you take that aviation approach, there's a whole bunch of different knobs that have to be set exactly correctly for the whole system to work. And that then translates into expertise around maintenance and operations and the envelope in which you can fly and how do you set up the scan so that you get the data the way that you want. So all of that expertise has to be earned. And the IP is really in how that whole process happens from the initial design to the testing to the engineering proof points to the certification to the operations, and then how that interfaces with the customer and with the broader supply chain. Going back to your point earlier about the downstream effects, there's a couple of really interesting cases in point. For example, one of our early adopter customers, South Australia Power, that's a electricity operator in the state of South Australia. And when we first started operating and we did, those initial scans a little bit at a time and sort of they became more confident and we did more and more of their network. At one point, they did a quick calculation and they sort of presented this at a conference saying that introducing the drone obviously has its own risks where you have to mitigate for, but you're taking a helicopter out of the air, which is obviously a bigger risk, and you are reducing the number of hours spent by ground crews going out to check things, to respond to false positives. And they have statistics around, every 1,000 hours of driving, there'll be an incident on the road. Something will go wrong, there'll be a breakdown. You're taking all of that off the table because now you have good information from the air that can then guide the intervention as required. So you're only sending out ground crews to a known fault. They know what's there. They know what they have to do. They're not working blind. So that downstream saving is enormous. And that's really where the value lies.
I really love how you illustrated the downstream economic effect of this product, and that's something I always encourage entrepreneurs when they're getting ready for their pitch, right? Not only to tell about the value proposition, but also like the downstream economics, right? So if we did this program, it also going to affect this amount of people. Yeah, if I get 1% of the market share, I'll be this big. However, it's also going to affect this. For example, co-packing facilities. I'm always encouraged communities about co-packing facilities because there's a gap between the kitchen and the market shelves, right? There's a gap between. And for entrepreneurs to scale, sometimes cash flow becomes an issue. But if you have a co-packing facility where you're able to order a ton of sugar, except you're able to share it with 4 other entrepreneurs because one's doing maybe non-alcoholic beverages, one's doing CBD chocolates or something, who knows, right? Some type of F&B area. But nonetheless, you're splitting the cost, but you're using your buying power together to purchase that ton. Because it's actually cheaper to buy a ton than to buy, 1,000 bags or whatever it is to make a ton. So it's very interesting to provide that use case. And now I'm going to take it a little back. I want to pretend I'm a customer. Because I want to understand how this process works. I'm from Oregon. A lot of farmers out here. Let's say I'm a cattle rancher. We got about 500 acres, right? Got a lot of fence. I got to check out. Make sure my cattle has water out in the middle of nowhere. Do I just hire your team? Do I purchase one of these plants? How does a client kind of work with your team to kind of really utilize your services?
Yeah, just by the by, that's exactly a use case that we have done with the Meat and Livestock Association here in Australia. large cattle farms up in the north of Australia. Exactly right. Flying the fences, picking up our RFID information from the cattle, looking at water troughs and the levels and things like that. So basically, the pitch is we can give you that information more frequently, more economically, and more safely. Without spooking the cows, for example, because we don't make as much noise as a helicopter, without having to drive the fences. We can do that, regularly, more cheaply. So that's the pitch. And again, most of our customers tend to be not individual farmers, but again, like a utility, a mine, where they're an enterprise, they have large scale needs, and we concentrate on that. And I think the value proposition is really clear. It's just that ability to give you that data. Now, how that goes into the market is honestly still an evolving thing because it's a new market that we're creating. Obviously, the naive approach is I'll sell you a drone, I'll train you how to use it, and I'll support you. But that then opens up, the capex. It's really not something that anyone can just operate because it's a large aircraft, it's complex. So it really becomes a service. And then to do it, there's a regulatory element. So again, what airspace are you in? What permits do you need to fly beyond visual line of sight, for example, which we can do, but there's a process. And so it's really that alignment around how do you want us to deliver the service? Do you want us to come and fly? Do you want to own the aircraft and we operate it? Do you want to lease it? Do you have your own operator and we'll supply into them? So there's a few different options. Our preferred model is we're a managed service. So we will own the relationship with the customer, figure out the needs of the mission, make the aircraft available, and then either go and fly it ourselves or hire an operator to go and fly it as a subcontractor. So that's the easy version, I guess, the way that we've actually approached the market. And again, from a business point of view, it makes sense because we're utilizing our fleet very efficiently. We're not having aircraft sitting in people's properties waiting to be used. We can move them around as required. We can bring them in and maintain them and upgrade them as needed. And we know that the operator is always someone that we've trained, that we've qualified, that knows what they're doing. And it makes it easier for the customer because it's an OpEx expense. It's basically it's a service that they're contracting. They don't really care how we do it as long as they get good data. Now, on something like a power line, for example, it actually becomes quite a complex supply chain because there are parts of the network where it's more optimized for, say, a multi-rotor because it might be in the middle of a town with houses around and it's much more of a vertical flight than a horizontal flight.
Makes sense.
And then we'll partner with someone who operates a multi-rotor. In some circumstances where you're flying over a dense populated area and you need a certified aircraft, it might still be a mission that you do with a helicopter. But there's that sort of combining those solutions, and we can do the bulk of it because of, again, the long distances, the straight lines, and bring the total cost down significantly, and then coordinate with the other suppliers. And that approach that you mentioned before about collaboration, that's really critical to our values. It's really core. We're saying we're good at this. We're good at making a flying platform that carries your payload that stays in the air for a long time. We're not the payload manufacturer, so we work with them effectively to service the same customer. So we put an aircraft in the air. It needs a payload. They make the payload, and the payload again can be a LiDAR scanner or a camera. Similarly, with the post-processing, we capture the raw data and we get it to a point where it's clean and it's geotagged and it's ready to use. But we don't necessarily specialize in getting those insights at the level of what a utility needs or what a mine needs or what a farm needs. There are people who specialize in that. We feed the data into them and then we'll either white label it or they'll do their own thing. But we're really not trying to be all things to all people, saying, this is what we're good at. This is where we add value. This is the network that we live within and the ecosystem. And similarly with the supply chain, which is maturing very quickly. We're not competing with our suppliers. We're not competing with our customers. Being really clear about that is very important.
I'm going to pull out two things that I really, really enjoyed. One, obviously, it's very interesting, like your kind of progression, first and foremost, into this whole industry because I'm also looking at like, yeah, it's going to be really expensive if an operator was operating one of those planes and crashed it like that I'm assuming these things are relatively expensive. And so that is really interesting because you're you do have these options, right? You're kind of given these options. You can either own the plane, you can have all these other things. With those options, you mentioned like the most suitable one is being the one where you kind of collect the data. And another thing, so there's two things, folks, I want to pull out. One, Dario, so what he mentioned too is like they're looking at, he has the core competencies. I know I'm really good at making the planes, right? I'm not the camera guy, I'm not the data guy, I'm the plane guy. Okay.
Mm.
That is really important for a lot of people to understand. Like you have your zone of genius, right? And that's a zone of genius. And then you have your core competencies. Like I'm really good at these things, but the zone of genius is like I'm really good at doing it and I like doing it. And when I'm doing it, I actually don't like time just flies by because I don't, I'm just having fun doing it. Right. That's your zone of genius. And I think that's really where Dario and his team has been focusing on their zone of genius. Now, another thing I really like about it is when he's mentioning is like, hey, I'm not the data person, but I know who it is. I'll reach out to him and I'll white label it. So if you're an entrepreneur out there, that's another thing to be thinking about. There, you could create a SaaS product to help people like Dario, right? You can create to make his job easier, allow him to white label it. You know, your client base, instead of it being all entrepreneurs, maybe it's just all business developers or business coaches, right? So you're actually helping the business coach the entrepreneur, right? So you can kind of think about the levels of different iterations and innovations in different markets, and I think this was a good example of it, right? Where one, you're really focusing on your zone of genius, which is I think is really cool, just focusing on that. But then also two, finding key partners and seeing the value proposition, and if you white label it, cool, and if not, then just taking over them, which is just as great, right? Now,
Mm.
Dario, where one of the things you kind of mentioned, you do like to kind of be there. You prefer to capture the data yourself and operate the planes themselves. Are you guys currently only operating in Australia, and is that limiting your scalability outside of Australia?
No, we do have a presence in the US. It's through a partner operator that's, again, trained on our system. They can maintain it, repair it, fly it, train people. It's relatively new that they've been operating our system for maybe 2 years now. They've procured work in wildfire monitoring, for example, in Canada. So they've been doing work that way. They've been doing some power line stuff and some agricultural stuff, and it's sort of that beachhead. It's the beginning of the expansion into the US market. The way we look at it is Australia is a proving ground. It's still a big enough market because of the geography to keep us very busy. But when you consider the size of the market, like Texas alone is basically the same as all of Australia, and there's 50 of them. So I think that is the future. That's what we want to expand into. There's also a dual use aspect to the technology. So we do have some military customers that use it for what they call ISR, which is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Started out in the US, then we've sold some into Australia. So again, it's a slightly different model because that is unit sales because they sort of go and do their thing with it. But having that dual use is also another way to get into that market, particularly now with AUKUS and the relative closeness of the alliance. So definitely the US is the next market for us. But obviously being able to prove ourselves over here is important.
Yeah, and it's interesting to the drone market. I feel like there's a lot of use case scenarios here in the States, especially with the wildfires that are kind of constantly going through, and I feel like there's always going to be a need for the surveillance. Now, you mentioned you kind of have two verticals, right? You have the military kind of contracts, which is unit based, so you're selling a plane per plane, and then you have the service base, right? The more concierge service will come over and do it. Are you planning? It seems like there's almost enough market space to just kind of focus on those two verticals, or are you planning to kind of jump into a different vertical?
I think the problem, and a lot of entrepreneurs are going to find that, is that there's too much. There are too many options, and trying to be all things to all people, and learning that lesson early that you want to be very good at a specific thing before you take on anything else. So again, the approach initially was necessarily the platform is fairly agnostic. So whether we're flying over a mine or a power line, or a battlefield or a national park or a fire, it's the same physics. It's the same aircraft. It's the same requirements in terms of flight time, ability to be stable in weather, carrying a payload. All of those things are the same. But the markets that you're selling into are quite different. So the culture in a mine is different to the culture in a power line. The economics of a farm are different to the economics of a state fire department. And because you're introducing something new and you're tending to go into fairly conservative, safety conscious industries that are not necessarily fast adopters, you can really end up spinning your wheels if you're doing one mission for fire over here and one mission for a mine over there. So we very early on, very consciously just narrowed the focus and saying, because we're known, we have a reputation, we have people knocking on the door saying, I want to put a magnetometer on it and go prospecting, or I want to do this, I want to do that, and go and inspect offshore wind farms. It's all fantastic. Like, as a nerd, technically, I want to do all of the things. But then you look at the market and it's like, I can spend the same time integrating a payload that has a market of one customer as I can integrating a payload that has a market of 1 million customers. Which one am I going to do with my resources? And you very quickly narrow it down. And again, the reason for the linear infrastructure focus is really that fit where they're in the middle of nowhere, so it's relatively easy to tick all the boxes to be able to fly. They're spread out. They don't have a good solution at the moment, and there are few customers with large needs. So you can have 5 utilities, and that'll be a multi-million-dollar revenue stream for the business for the foreseeable future. And once you're in, it's very sticky because getting over all those moats around the auditing and the permits and the trust, very difficult for someone to come in and take that away. So it's really, as much as I'd like to do more, right now the focus is very specific on those industries, getting that traction, becoming really good. But then the future for me is getting those unit economics down. And to do that, the answer is more automation, fewer humans. And so you do that by having remote one-to-many operations, for example, instead of having a guy in the field standing in front of ground control station monitoring the aircraft as it goes and does its thing. That person can be in an office. You can do that with remote links. That person can be monitoring 10 aircraft doing a flight rather than one. And that's really where you start to get the scale. And that's going to happen in the next few years. Like, we are flying remotely from the office, but we tend to have a person in the field just in case. That will obviously get better with detect and avoid, automated actions in response to stimuli out in the field. So that's really where the tech is going to evolve into more automation.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I really like what you're saying, folks. I hope you guys are like taking a note. If not, check out theshadesofE.com. Make sure you subscribe because I think he just gave you guys a masterclass in entrepreneurship. One, really focus on your core competencies. Make sure you dial those in. But I really love the research piece that he also mentioned. So Dario was kind of highlighting. He didn't just go to any industries. He really wanted to highlight the industries, like what's the correlation coefficient of this industry. So what I mean by that is, what's the 1-to-1? If I have a 1-to-1, or do I have a 100-to-1? So for every 100 people do I talk to, I make one sell, or for every one person I talk to, I make one sell. And so Dario is basically trying to make that pool smaller because, like he said, if I get 5 contracts, that's a multi-million-dollar business. One of the things we did for a pitch competition, I was coaching this individual. And I was like, why don't you to talk about just that 1% market share in the crema industry? That 1% is like $100 million. So again, it's like, that's the way you kind of have to see it. But I think a lot of times people go into industries that are oversaturated already. And so it's important as an entrepreneur, if you're thinking about going into endeavor, do a little pre-research too, to see where it's at. Another good way to kind of do this, to be honest with you, is look at job openings. If you go around and you look at job openings and classifications and you see like a specific industry that's in need, I actually learned this from a former guest, is apply for the job, and then during the interview process, like, hey, would you guys ever be interested in maybe take on a contract worker, and so you can kind of gauge their interest that way as well. But again, I really love what Dario said because he's really focusing on the core competencies of the business, and they want to become the best, like the experts in that field. Not only that, but he did his research to make sure that those fields were in fact scalable, right? Somebody wasn't already in that area and it wasn't already saturated or innovation already happened. And so that's I really, really like that thought process and going for it. Now, what about for Dario? What's in the future for Dario himself? What do you plan in the next 5 years or so?
Just a further point to what you just said before we get into me. Um, it's interesting that um, it's easier said than done, right? It's very difficult as a startup business that's really eager to prove the capability and to get revenue. When someone knocks on the door with an opportunity, it's like, wow, customer, let's make them happy. Let's do the thing. And being able to actually say no, to say, look, yes, this is great, but the prospects with what we're already doing are better. Uh, Um, and looking at the path from, like, we have this expression in the business called POC land, proof of concept land, where you might get engaged by the innovation department that's like the R&D arm of a utility, and they're really excited. They want the new tech. You go out there, you do your thing, and then they get the data, and then nothing happens. It's like you need to have in mind, yeah, fine, we're going to do this proof of concept, but only if there's a path to a contract behind it. Otherwise, it's a waste of our time. Like, yeah, it's a great news story we publish, and we all hug and shake hands. But the reality is that you need that path. You need to say, okay, if I do this, what's on the back of it? If I don't do this, what resources am I freeing up to do something else? So having that critical approach, I guess, requires confidence. You need to be able to say, I can say no to this and we'll still survive. And again, you need the resources, you need the funding. You say, well, this other thing that I want to go after, it might take another 6 months, it might take more R&D, but the payoff is there and the customer's already put their hand up, so let's go for it. So it's really that balance. And it's difficult, particularly when you're in the hardware world, which hardware is hard. It's capital intensive. You're building things, you have overheads, you have equipment, you have people operating it. So you need to be confident that you can resource it to get to where it needs to get to.
Yeah, and I would also encourage people to think about that also within your personal life. I know I've been kind of going through that myself. And for example, folks, I've been in the healthcare industry for over 20 years. So now I'm being very methodical about what I'm doing in the healthcare industry. As a lot of people know, I've been doing a lot of public speaking for the past decade or so. Okay, well, now on top of that, start doing public speaking. Okay, what's the next iteration? All right, well, next iteration, let me just start doing some coaching, right? Let me start coaching some physician executives, how to build out a refer and provide a funnel, how to create the strategic plan, how to create tactics, goals, and KPIs. Okay, now what's next? Well, the goal now is at those conferences when I'm doing lectures. Okay, now I got my coaching sessions. Hey, would you like a coaching session? Also, by the way, here's a fancy new book I wrote. By the way, you can purchase the book after the conference. So the goal, again, that's the funnel, right? The funnel for me now is the lectures, and then getting them engaged is either them signing up for this newsletter or for them taking a book or something, right? And then the loyalty piece is actually them becoming a client of mine, right? And then them showing, sharing on the social media or talking about and providing a testimonial. And the reason I say I was kind of struggling is because as I've been doing the podcast and as I've been working with Latino founders, as a lot of you know, the nonprofit we started, our goal is to help scale 100 businesses to $1 million recurring revenue in 5 years, right? But my focus, my core competencies, my level of expertise is healthcare. So as these opportunities come up and say, "Hey, can you help me scale my business?" I'm like, "Well, I'm happy to, but my focus, my core competency is the healthcare world. That's where I know how to scale a business. I know how to scale a business in that specific industry." Now, I can provide you some tips of how I've scaled businesses in the industry that may be applicable to your industry, but it's not going to be apples to apples all the time. And so, because of that, I've now, really started to narrow my focus and say, no, healthcare is the vertical I will be in versus general entrepreneurship or operations or marketing, right? It's healthcare. And so that's just kind of an example of what, Dario was saying, but from my own personal, kind of life lessons that I've been going through. But yeah, it's been very cool and very fascinating, Dario, speaking with you, because again, I'm really intrigued to kind of see how you continue to scale. And I'm hoping we'll see you out here in the West Coast because Lord knows we need you. Now, Dario, before we go, is there any last words?
Just in Oregon, we have been out there. There's a what they call a UAS accelerator, which is effectively a test site for drones. And we've flown there to do various tests with our US partners. So it's a beautiful part of the world.
Well, anytime you're out, sir, please look me up, and I'll happy to give you some tips and advice, take you out and grab you a drink or something, because Oregon is a gorgeous, gorgeous location. Now, before we go again, Dario, how can people connect with you if they're interested in learning about you, maybe learning more about carbonics? How can they find more information about you?
Yeah, probably the starting point is our website, carbonix.com.au. My LinkedIn, yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn, we'll connect. And yeah, watch this podcast.
Yeah, so watch the podcast. And again, folks, this podcast will be available for our Patreon members, $5 a month. We'll get it a week early, and they'll get some special treats afterwards, as well as on podcast. Will be available on all streaming stations. You can find it on the Shades of E as well as YouTube. And you can follow us on the social sites, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and LinkedIn. Thank you, and have a great night.